Honorable Senators, I'm honored to speak today to second reading of Bill C-220, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code bereavement leave. And I'd like to begin by thanking Senator Seidman for her speech. I confess I had been proceeding on the assumption that I would be the sponsor of this bill, a role which I'd been personally asked to take on some months ago and a role I was happy and honored to assume. However, last night I was surprised to find myself instead the critic of the bill, a role I'm still happy to take on, even though it may be a harder task, since the bill does frankly not provide much opportunity for a tough critique. Bill C-220 is a simple and straightforward proposition. As Senator Seidman has explained, it amends the Canada Labour Code to add 5 more days of unpaid bereavement leave for any worker whose employer is federally regulated and hence governed by our federal labor code. That would encompass roughly 18,500 employers and about 6% of Canada's workforce. That includes people who work in the air transportation sector, such as those who work for airlines and airports. It includes anyone who works for a federally regulated bank. It includes people who work for most Crown corporations, such as Canada Post or Via Rail or Canada Mortgage and Housing. It also includes people who work for federally regulated grain elevators, feed, and seed mills. It encompasses First Nations band councils and those who work at maritime ports. It also includes people who work in radio and television broadcasting and those employed by railways that cross provincial or international borders, such as CP or CN. And it also applies to those who work in telecommunications for telephone, internet, and cable companies. It's not a complete list, of course, but it gives you some sense of the scope of this legislation. Currently, employers who are governed by the Canada Labour Code are required to give employees who are mourning the death of an immediate family member 5 days of bereavement leave. Of that time, 3 days are paid leave and 2 are unpaid leave. Bill C-220 would give employees in mourning the option of adding another 5 days of unpaid leave to the total, which would give them the opportunity to take 2 full weeks off work to cope with the practical and emotional consequences of the death of a close relative. Mostly, as Senator Seidman said, those relatives would be people who you would think they are: parents, children, spouses, common law partners, siblings, grandparents, and grandchildren. But C-220 would also allow you to take the extra bereavement leave if you had previously been on a formal compassionate care leave to look after someone else close to you who was not technically part of your immediate family. So if, for example, you'd already received an official compassionate leave to care for your favorite aunt or your best friend, you would also qualify for bereavement leave. Workers who asked for this new bereavement leave wouldn't be required to take it all at once continuously. They could break up their leave. For example, a person might take a few days off to deal with the immediate shock of a loss, and then take a few days more weeks later, perhaps to plan a funeral, or to move their elderly mom's furniture out of the assisted living facility, or to organize after-school care for a child who has lost a parent. Until you have lost a family member yourself, you may not realize how much hard work there is to do in the aftermath of a death. You don't just need time off to mourn. You need time to take care of dozens of bitterly practical matters, whether that's dealing with the phone company when you try to disconnect a dead relative's phone, dealing with the bank as you try to close accounts, or packing a lifetime of mementos and tchotchkes into cardboard boxes. In our post-COVID future, when travel becomes easier and safer again, such extended or delayed leave could also be helpful for someone who needed to travel across the country or around the world to attend a loved one's memorial. As long as the bereaved employee took their 10 days within 6 weeks of their loved one's death, they would have the flexibility to use the time as their family and cultural circumstances demanded. The leave would be available for all people in an employment relationship with a regulated employer. That includes people who work part-time, on contract, or even on a casual basis. And if you were unlucky enough, say, to lose 2 parents in the same calendar year, you would still be accommodated. Bereavement leave could take place any time suffered the loss of an immediate family member, even if they endured multiple losses in a year. And that, Honorable Senators, is Bill C-220 in a nutshell. If, or I hope to say when, it receives royal assent, it will come into force 3 months after the date on which it passes into law to allow employers sufficient time to adjust their workplace policies and to work with unions to modify collective agreements to align with the changes. It isn't a complicated piece of legislation. It's a simple acknowledgement that the death of a loved one is a universal human experience, and that most of us, humans, need a little time as we mourn and as we deal with the paperwork, the planning, and the probate. Every person, every family, every culture grieves differently. Some people, in truth, hate the idea of taking 2 weeks off from their regular routine in the wake of a passing. Some might find the idea of throwing themselves back into work and into some semblance of normalcy far more therapeutic than 2 weeks at home to cry and brood. But of course, no one would be required or pressured to take the full 10 days of leave. It would simply be an option open to them. For others, it must be said, 2 weeks away from work wouldn't begin to be enough time to process their sorrow and loss. The death of an elderly parent is sad. The loss of a young child, that's a grief of a very different kind. But this compassionate extension of bereavement leave could be helpful to many of those who feel overwhelmed, not just emotionally, but by the crushing number of stressful tasks they have to complete in the aftermath of a family death. There's a practical benefit for employers, too. An employee dealing with the strong emotions that often accompany a death, or an employee simply distracted by the stress and burden of all the hundreds of responsibilities, large and small, that can come in the wake of a loss, might be a liability on the job. It may actually be easier for supervisors and colleagues and clients if someone coping with profound bereavement isn't rushed back to work before they're psychologically ready. In this year of COVID-19, we've all come face to face with our own mortality and the fragility of life itself. Quite a few of us here in this chamber are mourning for friends and family lost during this difficult year. There could be no more apt moment than this to debate Bill C-220 and to make it law. Bill C-220 is the brainchild, or perhaps I should say the heartchild, of Matt Genereux, the MP for the Alberta riding of Edmonton Riverbend. Like me, he lives in Edmonton, a Miskatchewan in the heart of Treaty 6 territory. And the intertwined issues of compassionate care and bereavement leave have long been his preoccupation. Before entering federal politics, Matt Genereux was a progressive conservative member of the Alberta legislature in the governments of Alison Redford, Dave Hancock, and Jim Prentice. That's when I first met him, when he was a young MLA, and I was a not-quite-so-young journalist writing about Alberta provincial politics. As a backbench MLA, Matt Genereux introduced a private member's bill entitled Compassionate Care Leave Legislation, the first of its kind in the history of Alberta. The legislation provided a leave of absence for an employee while taking care of a terminally ill loved one. The Compassionate Care Leave Act gave Albertans 8 weeks of job-protected time off to care for a family member with a serious or fatal condition. The law amended Alberta's Employment Standards Act so that people thrust into the role of caregiver could devote their time to the person they loved without fear of losing their job, seniority, or pay level. In fact, Alberta became the very last province in Canada to legislate compassionate care leave when the Act came into effect in 2014. It was Mr. Genereux's efforts as a backbench MLA that allowed the province to finally catch up with the rest of the country. When Matt Genereux became a member of Parliament, he wanted to address a different gap. He wanted to ensure that someone who had been granted a compassionate care leave to help a loved one dying of a condition such as cancer or arterial lateral sclerosis wouldn't have to rush back to work after a death. To him, it made no sense to give a person time off to perform the stressful, difficult task of caring for a dying family member and then rush that same person right back to their office or job site the moment their vocation as a caregiver had reached its sad conclusion. So the original intent of this bill was simply to extend compassionate care leave to cover off the time after a family death. Hence the bill's original title, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code, Compassionate Care Leave. It was a worthy idea, but it made for a somewhat complicated bill because the extended leave had to be related to the length of the original caregiver leave. As well, the original bill would only have helped those who had been designated official caregivers and who were on a formal compassionate leave. It wouldn't have applied to someone who'd been doing a lot of caretaking while also working. It wouldn't have helped people who'd lost a family member to a sudden death, to a heart attack, a car accident, a suicide, or COVID-19. But a quite inspiring thing happened when Bill C-220, a private member's bill from a Conservative MP, had hit the committee stage in the other place. MPs from all parties, including the government, came together to pass amendments and make this a better, more inclusive bill. Now, Bill C-220 applies to all who mourn someone very close to them, even if that person died suddenly and unexpectedly. Indeed, it may be argued that those who lose a family member without warning may often be the ones in the greatest need of bereavement leave, since they're dealing with the greatest shock and haven't had any time to prepare themselves. Even though it was a bill drafted by a member of the official opposition, C-220 earned the support and endorsement of Anthony Housefather, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Labour, and of the Labour Ministry itself. And working together, MPs from all parties got behind Matt Genereux and passed this bill unanimously through the other place. Is this a perfect piece of legislation? It is not. And in my sudden and unexpected role of critic, I do have some critiques to offer. Unpaid leave is a start, but some might well advocate for 10 days of paid leave so that people already facing extraordinary stresses would not have to give up some of their income in order to get time off. For some people, giving up a week and a half of salary would be an insurmountable obstacle, which would render them unable to take advantage of this new entitlement. As the bill stands now, it might be quite useful to people who have well-paid jobs and savings in the bank, and much less useful to those who are living paycheck to paycheck. In a perfect world, some would doubtless want to see this kind of bereavement leave extended to all Canadian workers, not just the 6% of those governed by the Canada Labour Code. On the other hand, there will also be smaller employers in particular who may feel that they just can't manage to give people 2 weeks off, especially in this COVID era, when some employers have been scrambling to fill positions while workers are ill or in quarantine. And because C-220 began its life as a private member's bill and not government legislation, there has frankly not been a lot of time for consultation with the various labour unions who represent the eclectic range of workers covered by the Canada Labour Code. So no, this bill isn't perfect, and now that I am the critic, it's my job to point that out. But it is an important first step, and a model of what future policies might look like, an inspiration for lawmakers and contract negotiators across the country. This bill? It's a start, and you don't go anywhere until you start. Because if one thing unites us all, my friends, it is the inevitability of death and the inevitability of mourning. When we love, if we are lucky enough to love, we know that grief could very well be the price that we pay for our love. We know that death eventually parts us all. And that is why our collective efforts on this bill, as a whole Senate, are so important. When we grieve, we don't grieve as members of the ISG or the CSG or the PSG or the CPC. We grieve not as acronyms or ideology, but as people, touched and linked by our common humanity and our common mortality. Because all of us go into one place. All are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. For everything, after all, there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. For so much of this year, Canadians have known a time to weep and a time to mourn. It has been a year of death and loss and sorrow. We have all been bereaved in one way and another. But now, my friends, as we begin, slowly, to put the horrors of this year behind us, it is time to build together. A time to build the foundations for the future we wish to share. A time when we can come together to give Canadians a time to heal. That's why, even though I wasn't allowed to keep my promise to Matt Genereux and to serve as sponsor of this bill, I'm still deeply honored to serve as its critic. And I'm deeply thankful to Senator Seidman for her commitment to serve as sponsor, also at very short notice. Working together as a team in a cooperative and nonpartisan way, I hope we can move Bill C-220 through the Senate as quickly as possible and make it a reality for thousands of working Canadians. Thank you, merci, and hi.
Senator Simons, la sénatrice.
Senator Deakin, Ontario, you have a question. So, will you take a question? Yes, I certainly will.
Ontario.
Thank you, merci. And thank you, Senator Seidman and Senator Simons, for such eloquent speeches this evening. And I do have one question, and it sounds like you're digging into this and really having a look at what it's meant at committee so far in the House and some of the improvements that you've discussed. I've worked away at this in a large employer and trying to get that sweet spot between grieving, loss, and bereavement and how different it is across populations. I continue to look at this from an equity and inclusion perspective. And my question and wonder is, as we're digging into this, can you tell me at this moment You talked about at the beginning many examples of who's included, and you gave us a great idea of the large width of organizations and companies that are included. Could you tell me, as you go through this, who you think might feel excluded or might feel the gap of hope in being able to deal with loved ones has widened even further for them, the perception?
Well, I mean, the challenge of this bill, of course, is that it only applies to the 6% of Canadians who are governed by the Canada Labour Code, because that is what is in our purview as federal politicians to regulate.
Right.
So the hope has to be that if the federal government takes the first step, that this will serve as a model for people who are governed under provincial labor regulations. So, yes, it will leave out 94% of Canadians. But as I say, it is a first step. And maybe if other Canadians say, hey, how come my friend who works for, for Chum gets this leave and I don't? How come people who work, for CP get this leave, but people, who work for, for Loblaws do not? It serves as a model.
Sure.
I mean, there's only so much a private member's bill can do. And I think Matt has taken this bill where it can go.
No, excellent. And that 6% is really important. I was wondering also at the committee level if they had started some of those provincial TSO maybe conversations. So thank you very, very much.